Our next panel is going to be the discussion on sustainable business models and paying for the transition. So our second question is related to this paying for the transition. So you can go there and cast your votes. Please do so while I get on with introducing our speakers for session 2, or rather the panel session 1, but the second part of today's event. So we have joining us remotely, we have Eduardo Cuoco, who is the director of iFarm Organics Europe. Joining me here in the studio, we have Ben O'Brien, director from Europe of Beef and Lamb New Zealand, and also Baz Ruta, global head of sustainability at Rabobank. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining me. Ben, let me start with you. The question for this panel is sustainable business models and paying for the transition. Give me your opening thoughts and your opening comments to set out the rest of our debate.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's good to be here today, and I'd like to thank the organisers for this opportunity to address you this afternoon, to give you a perspective from New Zealand on how we go about the business of sustainable food production. We've just heard from the chairman that the market signals in the food chain are broken and must be fixed. I agree, but perhaps rather than being completely broken, maybe they're just being a little distorted. For the past 4 years, I've been observing European agriculture and involved in discussions and debates on the regulatory and trade environment, talking to my European counterparts about their farm businesses and the impact that consumers, society, and government have on them. When I came here 4 years ago, I was struck by what was to me a different agricultural policy environment, characterised by special pleading and intense lobbying, focusing on the size of a subsidy budget, who should get what from it, and under what conditions. As you are no doubt aware, New Zealand abolished all its farm subsidies in the mid-1980s. We are by no means unique. Of course, a significant number of other countries have few or no subsidies. So in New Zealand, there are no single farm or direct payments, no eco payments or subsidies for fertiliser, farm equipment or animal welfare. Farm businesses are treated like any others and are expected to bear the full costs of their operations themselves. On top of that, industries have to pay for government services such as market access, traceability and post-border biosecurity. You can be sure, though, that under a user pays regime, industry is well motivated to ensure these activities operate efficiently and are accountable. So with no subsidies, there is less lobbying and strong, clear market signals. It means farmers focus on their businesses rather than completing forms for government payments or modifying their businesses to be eligible for government funding. So that's the context in which we operate. So how does New Zealand agriculture approach the issue of sustainability? Well, first of all, there's the law. The Resource Management Act prohibits impacts on natural resources and sets out a management enforcement regime. Everyone has to comply with the law at their own cost. It's effects-based, that is to say, it prohibits detrimental effects on the environment rather than prescribing prohibited or permitted actions. So an example would be that there is no national or even regional limit on fertiliser application, but there are local limits on nutrient levels in waterways. This places the broader responsibility for protecting the environment on the land users, but allows them freedom of action in how they go about avoiding nutrient loss to waterways. Climate change law includes an emissions trading scheme, which puts a price on carbon, and the recent Zero Carbon Act designed to meet our obligations under the Paris Agreement with the national objective of being carbon neutral by 2050. The agricultural sector has pledged to achieve its targets through a program entitled He Waka Eke Noa. Roughly translated, that means we're all in the same canoe, or we're all on the same journey together. The result will be a nationwide farm-level reporting and pricing of emissions. The sheep and beef sector, for its part, has already reduced emissions by over 30% since 1990, and we have recently completed a study of vegetative sequestration on our farms, which puts above-ground carbon storage at 90% of emissions on an annual basis. On the freshwater side, what are we doing? Well, at the highest level, the quality of fresh water must be maintained or improved. On farm, it means a mandatory freshwater module must be incorporated into farm plans. Farm plans started out as management tools developed and promoted by organisations such as the one I work for, to help farmers identify environmental risks on their farms and develop plans to manage them. Local authorities have since adopted them within their regulatory requirements. I've mentioned some of the latest regulatory initiatives, but alongside these are the commercial imperatives. Meat exporting companies have long had requirements placed on them by their customers, most notably the supermarket chains that apply very strict specifications for the products they purchase. They have no difficulty in exerting their considerable market power to ensure high standards are met. As a result, processors and exporters in New Zealand have always had very strict conditions of supply. The compliance, verification, and audit requirements are ever increasing and are now incorporated into a National Farm Assurance Program, the NZFAP. Finally, the NZFAP provides a quality and compliance framework for the Taste Pure Nature promotional program that's being rolled out in selected global markets in support of company marketing programs. There, in a nutshell, is an idea of how New Zealand is dealing with the issue of sustainability. It's an alignment of policy, regulation, technology and education, market signals, and commercial disciplines. Farmers and processors are strongly incentivised in their businesses to provide a product that meets the highest of sustainability standards to a global market. I'd like to think, too, that it's not just the law and profits that motivate our farmers to become more sustainable, but also a strong inner desire to make the world a better place for future generations. A motivation I'm sure they share with their colleagues here in Europe. I hope that this brief snapshot is helpful. Ngā mihi mō tō aro.
Thank you very much. Now, just a reminder again, before we go to our next speaker for this panel, that you have a question that you can answer on Mentimeter, which is who should pay for the implementation of greater sustainability in the food system? We'll come and see the results of that after we've heard the opening statements from each of our three speakers. And our second speaker is Eduardo Cuoco. Eduardo, let me give the floor to you for your opening thoughts.
Thank you, Jennifer, and welcome to everybody who is connected and watching us. I'm Eduardo Cuoco, the Director of Organics Europe, and I'm very glad for being here with you. So I would like to thank the ELO for inviting me. Let's frame a bit the discussion from an organic point of view. We do believe that the agro-industrial intensification, the industrial agriculture model that we have now, is generating a vicious circle. And this intensification is giving as a result a threat to productivity, and then it requires further intensification and new industrial solution. Indeed, this system has succeeded to provide a large quantity of food products for the international market. However, this system also produced a large number of negative effects on the environment, on the socioeconomic, as well as on health and well-being of our community. So we believe that just diminishing, for example, chemical input in a system that doesn't work could reduce some negative effect, but will not be sufficient to provide a long-term solution in a very comprehensive manner. So that's why we believe that it's crucial and fundamental to call for a change of the agricultural system, a model that goes into a virtuous circle where inputs are minimized, soil is preserved, organic matter is increased, diversification brings together livestock crops, and we also increase biodiversity. We believe that such a transition will bring together and will be stronger and will bring a stable output, reducing the need for further industrialization solution. So we are called today to discuss about pricing and how we can make, who is going to pay for this transition. Well, I think when it goes to cost for the transition, we need to think about it in a very holistically way. On one hand, we need policy who will help farmers to create new business model for rewarding of the public goods that they deliver to society. For example, what we do, what organic farmers do. On the other hand, we need that the enlargement for sustainable organic products is on the market. So we need to enlarge the market, and we need to guarantee in the meantime that all farmers get a fair and stable price for their production. I mean, despite the COVID-19 crisis, every year for the last 10 years, in average 325,000 full-time equivalent jobs were disappearing in the agriculture and food sector in Europe every year. Almost 4 million farmers lost their farm in the last 10 years. So we do believe that taxpayer money should really be used to reward those farmers while contributing to the creation of the virtuous circle that I described above. We should also take into account that taxpayers are often really going in the wrong direction. I mean, currently, when a consumer is buying a product on the shelf of a supermarket, very often is paying for its product 4 times. At the counter of the supermarket, with their portion of taxes for a health sanitary system, with their taxes to restore the environment and mitigate climate change, and finally to the portion of their taxes going to the, for example, the common agriculture policy, which might reward farmers who are just instead picking up the vicious circle of having more and more industrial solution. So in this frame, we believe that the farm to fork was a very interesting approach from the Commission. So in the context of the Green Deal, the farm to fork set a very interesting, sustainable driven target. And we believe that this should be more and more reflected into binding policy. And we understood that what happened last week in the European Parliament and the Council for what regards the common agricultural policy was not going exactly in this direction. But we still hope that the Commission will put all their efforts in trying to mitigate what was discussed in the Parliament and in the Council. To go to an end to my introduction, I would like to say that going to market and enlarging the market of sustainable products is a shared responsibility. We as organic sector, since long time, are organized together. Farmers, processor, trader, retailers, input provider, we discuss a lot together how we can reduce the cost of input and reward farmers for the contribution they give to the societal challenges. But we believe that to support a market, a better market for sustainable products, we need really different mechanisms. First, a mechanism that really reinforces the strength of cooperating between producer, processor, retailers in order to have prices that remain stable and ensure a fair remuneration to the producer. Then we believe that we need a progressive target in those policies who can really influence the market, such as, for example, procurement, public procurement. I mean, this can be a tool for policymakers to really support a transition toward more sustainable agri-food system. And then we do believe that member states can use taxation tools to support market. I mean, in the Green Deal communication, Ursula von der Leyen has put as an example the possibility for member states to reduce VAT on organic products. I mean, we believe this is an interesting idea, as well as we believe that might be an interesting idea having taxation on those harmful substances that are used in agriculture. So that's a bit my introduction. I hope this can help to enhance a better discussion with the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Once again, a reminder to our audience that your expert speakers are ready to answer your questions, so do use the Q&A option to send your questions through. And now we will hear the opening thoughts of our final speaker, Bas Ruta from Rabobank. Bas, over to you.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks for having me. A really good discussion at the right moment in time, I would say. But let me open briefly, because I think the dialogue with the people listening would be even more valuable than just my introduction. I have 4 points to make that I would like to introduce to you briefly and then have a little bit more in-depth insight. I think in order to be able to reward sustainability in the food system in the way it should be done in the long run, it's truly important as a first item that we introduce true prices. So true prices means that the collective value of the services and the goods produced are reflected in what we need to pay when we go to the supermarket. I think in general it is clear that that has not yet been the case, and as a result people make different choices than what is logic and good. Secondly, if we think that that is the right approach, then it's also important that we as financial institutions make sure that we integrate those types of true prices in our products and services. So the access to and the price of credit should be linked to the sustainability performance of our clients. Thirdly, I think it's truly important that we do not see this something as the market or the government or an individual player in the supply chain. It's a collective challenge to enhance sustainability in the food system. And as a result, it requires coalitions, if possible, wide coalitions to actually realize those goals. And fourthly, yes, there is a role to play by the government, both on a regional level, a national level, and also at EU and global levels. So that's an important thing to say, but it is definitely not the only one to play a role. Now on true pricing, I think it's important that the market has the basic power to steer the consumer preferences. Market prices define how we value goods, and the fact that negative external effects are not priced in proves that our market is not yet perfect, and we need to repair that. But it's complex, it involves influencing vested interests, and therefore it requires time and commitment of all players. Not to say the least, it requires consensus on what external effects are and how they should be weighed. So it's not easy. But economists will say that despite those hurdles, it's the most efficient way to influence consumer behavior without major public interference. And I think in the long run, in the way we've organized society, that is the road to go. And we think this is the most robust intervention. But a lot to be done. Now, secondly, on the role of the bank, because of course, you need to put your money where your mouth is if you make a statement like that. We're a cooperative bank focusing on agriculture, and as a result, we are focusing on long-term client relationships. And that also requires that the challenges we face on climate, on biodiversity, on the health effects of food are definitely things that we need to take into consideration. And that's why we've already 10 years ago started cooperating in a number of coalitions to actually introduce those types of measurement systems that help us to value those external effects, both positive and negative, in our service model. So to give you an example, we've worked with Royal Friesland Campina and the Worldwide Fund for Nature to introduce the biodiversity monitor for the dairy industry, which actually measures on farm level how they contribute to the biodiversity on their farm. That is, in a limited number of indicators, a very pragmatic way of measuring their performance. After finishing that, and that is now seen as a mainstream initiative to actually measure that performance on farm level for dairy farmers, we have also started to introduce the same monitor development for crop row farming. And we hope to be able to also use that tool going forward in our client servicing. And thirdly, but very importantly, also already mentioned, when it comes to soil, we have developed the Open Soil Index, which is actually an index in which we measure the soil quality of our clients from a physical perspective, from a chemical perspective, structure, but also the biodiversity in the soil. And also that is a way of measuring sustainability performance. Now it's important to say that this is a way of actually identifying strengths and weaknesses in our client base, where we hope to be able to promote the performance of our clients going upwards over time. And it is clear that we want to integrate that also in our pricing schemes and in our risk management systems. So we feel that improving that performance needs to be a journey between the bank and the client together. And we've had very positive feedback on the pilots we're doing. We hope to be able to integrate that in all our client servicing throughout food and agriculture. Now, the third one I mentioned is coalitions. And I think it's a key thing that we not just look at government or at individual consumers or at farmers, but we need to combine efforts in order to realize results. And a good example, very practical, is what is called the Delta Plan for Biodiversity Recovery. That was an initiative here in the Netherlands, in which farmers, but also nature conservation agencies, the government, but only in a sounding board role, but not so much in controlling the initiative, the water management bodies, they all work together to identify how we can actually work on revitalizing the countryside in the next decade to come. And we've been working on a number of topics, from shared values to earning models, laws and regulation to area-specific solutions, and on monitoring whether things actually go in the right direction. So that is definitely something where we see potential moving upwards if you combine a wide coalition where people work together. We see a lot of energy popping up, and we even see voluntary coalitions to actually raise the minimum standards for dairy produced, if we are able at the same time to safeguard that the true price will be paid by the farm gate. So we see definitely that working together works out. And then, of course, fourth and finally, a role for the government is definitely there to play. It is on an EU level, it's on a national level, but for instance also on a regional level, where we see that with a very large intensity of people living in Europe in general, but of course specifically also, for example, in the Netherlands, many of the issues we face on sustainability are also linked to spatial planning. We live with a lot of people in very small areas, and the optimal setup of those areas, combining agriculture, nature conservation, but also where cities and villages are situated, requires a collective effort. So we spend a lot of time with the government to identify how we can optimize the land being used and therefore minimize external effects, while at the same time revitalize the countryside. So those would be my four things to look into in this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bas. Now, you've outlined a lot there, and we've got a lot of questions already coming in. But first, let's go to our Mentimeter results and see the result of that question. Who should pay for the implementation of greater sustainability in the food system? Once again, the answer is all of the above. I'm starting to wonder if maybe we shouldn't have given you that option because it's the easy answer. But we see there a little bit more for private sector and for consumers rather than public funding. Let me start, Ben, by just asking you, does that result surprise you, or is it entirely expected?
I think, as you say, it's the easy option. Certainly from our perspective, there's only ever one group that pays, and that's the consumer. So you're always producing. In the end, it's a business of producing food products for consumers. And you need to be able to make a living from what it is that they're prepared to pay. So it's absolutely vital that the kind of price that you get is a true price, a real market price, not one which has been distorted or subsidised.
Thank you for your thoughts. I'll ask now that we go on to the next question for the Mentimeter, question for our audience, because we shouldn't just make all the panelists do the hard work, and that's what should mandatory labelling include? We'll come back in a few moments to see what your votes on that have been. As we can see in real time, people are already going for both. Again, it's the easy option. But to turn now, let me come back. Bas, I wanted to ask you, this question is who pays? And, as a bank, how often are you asked this question?
Very, very frequently. And I definitely think that in general, it is true that primary production is being paid by the consumer. And as a result, that's the logic thing to look at when you want to improve stuff. But at the same time, we also see imperfections in the market. So there's a lot of external effects that we currently don't price in. And as a result, people tend to make choices that they would have done differently if they would have understood what the indirect effects are of their purchasing. So I definitely think that we can no longer see agriculture purely as a private thing happening on the countryside. We need to understand that agriculture has a very important positive role to play in actually living in a place where it's worth living. And at the same time, there are currently negative external effects that we collectively need to minimize. And that cannot just be put on the plate of the farmer. It needs to be collectivized. So we need to, as a society, also value that raising sustainability performance among primary production, which is the food of us all, requires an investment by us all, either in a monetary compensation or in raising the bar for everyone, so that there's a level playing field in which we all produce and consume sustainably. We need to do it together again.
Eduardo, I'm sure you'll agree with most of what you've heard already. But let me ask you a little bit of a question more about, if you like, speed. So consumers really change their behavior very, very slowly. We already know that governments and policy happens at really a really glacial speed as well. So does that mean that food companies are the only hope to force a real change towards sustainable mass consumption in this short or medium term?
Let's start from the fact that sustainability cannot be achieved from one day to another. So it takes time to work on sustainability and make an agricultural food system sustainable. And all the different components of the supply chain needs this time. I mean, farmers need time to convert their farm, for example, to an organic management system, and so on does the industry and the retailing. So speed is indeed important, but it's also important to take the right speed to convert properly towards a more sustainable food system. So what we need to do, as I said before, is really to look at this transition with an holistic approach, to see how policy can support from one side the agri-food chain to make the transition happening, but also how can they support the market of those products in the first place. So we should really speed up in these regards, making policy that help the market to develop. And then we need to work on consumers' behavior, and we need to work on education to consumer. We need to explain them why this transition is important and why it's important that they choose sustainability instead of cheap prices. Let me say that we, as organic sector, when we look at prices, our farmers are the one who are having the best margins compared to conventional farmers. But we do believe that this is not enough. We do believe that we need fair prices for all the farmers. And at the moment, the food that we sell at farm gate is too cheap, is way too cheap. And consumers really do not understand that what they are saving in money, they are paying elsewhere. So I mentioned before some example of how this is paid, but we need to communicate. I mean, explaining to consumer the true cost of food, what Bud said before, is not an easy task, but it's something that we need to start doing, and this requires really all the actors working together and making sure that there is a good communication among the supply chain and then towards the consumers.
Thank you, Bas. I mean, sorry, and Eduardo, Ben, the same question to you then regarding this speed. Are companies the way to force things to happen, given that consumers and policy changes happen very slowly?
Well, I mean, first of all, change can only happen as fast as it's technically possible, okay? So that means that you need to have the science behind you in order to modify your behaviours. Secondly, the rate at which people will change their behaviours is dependent upon their incentives to change. So when you blunt those signals, when you spread costs across a society instead of putting it on the people who should bear those costs, then you reduce the rate of change. And then I guess the third thing is really that farmers will produce to what consumers want. And so, to a large extent, the main driver of change is always going to be the consumer, because I believe they're the ones that have the strongest lever to be able to impact on what people produce and how they produce it.
Bas, I want to turn to you with a question specifically related to the different regions of Europe. Now, they have a far greater level of intensity in certain sectors than in others. So how do we prevent a protective instinct on the part of individual member states or countries while, you know, they're sensitive to the demands of voters? That's the reality of the world we live in. So how can the real food chain be supported with political support?
That's not an easy question, and I totally understand the way the common agricultural policy is moving towards more autonomy also in dividing the subsidies, because I do think that I'm trained as an ecologist. There are differences within Europe when it comes to the countryside and factors for production. At the same time, I think it's important that we do not accept blindly the fact that farm subsidies have been used in many, many different ways throughout the countries within the European Union, and they need to focus on the results that are agreed upon at EU level. So I'm totally in favor of different measures and different subsidy schemes in different member states, as long as they strive for the same goal. And when I look at what's currently going on in the dialogue around the common agricultural policy and the friction with the farm to fork strategy, that I fear that in some member states this is seen as an urgent thing to look into, and as a result the money should be used to create incentives to do the right thing. But in other markets, I think the subsidies are still potentially used in a way that do not optimally move our production system in the right direction. So I think if at an EU level we want to have the same movement going on, it needs to be used and applied in a similar way throughout the EU in order to maintain a level playing field. Because a level playing field and true pricing are preconditions for consumer behavior shifting in the right direction.
Eduardo, the same question to you. What are your thoughts on the political situation and political support?
Sorry, I needed to unmute. As I said, I was a bit concerned looking at the results that were discussed, for example, about the common agricultural policy last week. I mean, we could see that both the European Parliament and the Council did not really support this transition toward a more sustainable food system. And this is a concern. If we really want to achieve a more sustainable approach, we need all the different parties working together. And as I said, I think there is a very important role also for local policy, for regional policy, and for really local authority. So we need to bring all of them together. We hope that the indication given by the European Commission with the Green Deal can really be uptaken at all the different levels. We need politicians move fast to understand what the citizens are asking for and take action. As I said, should not be underestimated the role of local government at city and regional level. They can also play a major role when it goes to deployment of local food policy and when it goes to procurement of food, which represent a very important market that can be shaped by policymakers.
I want to turn now to you, Ben, with a question that has come in from the audience, from Konstantin Golenbeck from Fertilizers Europe, in fact, to get the New Zealand perspective. And he's asking, what benefits does New Zealand see in focusing on the regulation of nutrient losses instead of limiting the use of fertilizers? Do you want to tackle that question?
Sure, no problem. I think the important thing about the whole of our Resource Management Act and approach to externalities, which I guess is what we've been talking about, is that it's those impacts on the environment which we're trying to avoid. Now, that can be achieved in a lot of ways, and sometimes it's best not to have politicians and bureaucrats decide exactly how they should be done, but to rather let the professional land managers make decisions which they believe are going to be most effective within their local environment to achieve the outcomes that have been set for them by society, by their community. So that then allows our farmers or land users to take into account all the factors involved in what causes nutrients to go into waterways, the climate, the soil type, the types of livestock that are being operated, the crops, the application techniques, and all those things in a way where they try to optimize the management of that whilst looking to ensure the outcome, knowing that if they fail to achieve the outcome, they're going to be held responsible, and that's going to be a cost to them.
Now, playing out there as we're seeing here in the EU. I want now to look at the results of our Mentimeter poll, the last one that we had asked there. Of course, everybody went for the easy answer once again, with very little difference between nutritional scoring only and environmental performance only. Bas, reflect on that. Which would you have voted for if I'd taken both off the table?
To be honest, I would have said the same to be. I also voted for both. I think the essence of food is the fact that we all rely on it to be healthy, and we also appreciate food as a very important part of our culture, and you need to be well informed to make decisions. At the same time, I think what is lacking significantly currently is that there's no consensus on the externalities I described when it comes to the real price of food. So we have not yet been able, and to be honest, we are looking into it jointly also with a number of people from the science side to actually identify how we can value externalities in order to be able to come to a true price. Because I think consumers in an optimal system can make informed choices, and on the basis of that, help steer the system into the right direction. In order to be able to do so, you need information on both elements. So it's definitely not one of the two. I think, to be honest, both are not as good developed as many of the financial indicators, including price at the cashier, are when you're in the supermarket. So we need to enhance the quality of both, and we need to have more detailed information available for consumers all over the world, including Europe, unfortunately.
Thank you. I'm going to take another question from an audience member, as it's very close to one I was going to ask myself anyway, which is from René Notborn from Farmode Europe. And the question is, how big or an important a role do you see of supermarkets playing in the sustainability discussion? So, I mean, retail obviously plays a huge role, but they will bear the brunt of displeasure of consumers when it comes to prices. What is the role, anyway, Eduardo, for retailers in general in delivering on sustainability?
Yeah, I think it's the easy answer, but retailers should be working together with all the other actors. They play a very important role because they are in contact directly with the consumer, so they can really make the difference. And I was discussing with our retailers last week, the briefing about this new situation of COVID-19, and we shared that in overall Europe, for example, organic products have raised their sales in supermarket, and many of them have tried to make them more available for consumers. So many consumers have decided to pay a little bit more for organic and spend a little bit on less to have more sustainable food. So I think really retailers can play an important role because they can help us in explaining to consumers how the price of a product is built on. I mean, what Basi said on externality and true cost is a really important issue. And it's not easy to explain to people how we can, how really the price should be built to make to make it accessible to consumers. So we should work more and more with retailers to make this is possible. And then let me say, I don't want to get into the details of this labeling about nutrition or environment, the two option you put on the table, but I think what we should really do is to have to incentivize consumption of healthy food by reducing the price for the consumers and by re-equilibrating the price along the supply chain.
Ben, the same question to you regarding the role of retailers. How important are they in driving change?
Well, I think they're very important in the sense that they very often act as a proxy for consumers and a gatekeeper, right? And that consumers, to some extent, rely on the retailers to ensure that appropriate standards are being applied to the products that the consumers are looking to buy, whether it be animal welfare or sustainable on-farm production or whatever. And that's tied up, I think, also in the supermarket brands. It's an opportunity for them to present to their consumers the sorts of things that they say they're going to look after for the consumer. And I think that is a really useful tool.
Well, I'm going to ask you a follow-up question before I come on to Bas on that one, because it has come in from an audience member, from Tom Murphy, from the Professional Agricultural Contractors of Ireland. He asks, Ben, with no food subsidies in New Zealand, is this reflected in a much higher cost of living?
Yes.
Okay. Right, well, that was a very succinct answer. Bas, will you be quite as succinct when I ask you to explain from your perspective the role of retailers and perhaps reflect on the cost of living question as well?
Well, first of all, I think it's great that we have food that doesn't take 60 or 70% of our income. But at the same time, I think food at the moment is too cheap. I happen to live in the country where the percentage spent of your income on food is least in the world. And I do definitely think that we look at the negative externalities of it. So that's just a side remark. When it comes to retail, I think there are two things that are really important to see. First of all, because of the fact that the average consumer is relying so strongly on retailers in their day-to-day choices, this also comes with responsibility for those retailers to actually live up to those expectations and to take that responsibility not too lightly. And I see increasingly that they are picking that up. I mean, I need to say that a number of the choices to be made within the supermarket today are much better informed than they used to be 10 or 15 years ago. At the same time, I see that while COVID was emerging, we saw a very strong trend towards local food. Many people saw that the long supply chains we rely on today, without too much of a knowledge of the individual consumer, whether that is actually going on, they were breaking. And we've been able to repair most of them in the Western world, but many of the supply chains in the South are still broken. And I think we also need to rebalance how we value the length of those supply chains. And I think if you know the farmer whose food you eat, if you understand the way your milk is produced and that the cow is involved, then you are also much easier able and willing to pay the real price that actually safeguards the proper environment you want to live in, the healthy food you want to eat, but also you respect the fact that you need to pay the farmer to produce it in a proper way. So I really think that retailers have a role to play in making people aware how their food was being produced and the impact that the production way, the way it was produced, has on the day-to-day environment you would like to work in, live in, recreate in during the weekend. And that's a really important role for retail. I see it moving in the right direction, but there's definitely more needed in order to have a more visible impact of those retailers on those types of dilemmas for consumers.
Thank you. Now, we're getting quite a lot of questions in, particularly now on the question of true prices. Keep your questions coming. Do send them in using the Q&A function on your screen. This one, it's directed at Bas, but I think I'm going to ask Eduardo to answer it as well. It's from Ramon Christopher Manero from Green Horizon Organics. And he's asking on introducing true prices, how much, for example, in percentage terms, would be our ideal maximum markup cost on organic produce. Eduardo, perhaps you could take that first, and then I'll come back to Bas as well with the same question.
Yeah, maybe I can give an example, because we made a study with a Dutch company actually on the true cost of food, and among others, we looked at the external cost for pest and disease control on 1 hectare of potatoes. So if we look only at the pollution that this pest and disease control had as a cost for the society, the cost was about 1,300 euros per hectare. And we compare this with the cost of what would be pest and control disease for organic, and the cost was 40 cents. So we have a difference of 1,300 euro on an hectare of potatoes. This 1,300 euro has been charged to society. So I think the question was how much markup we can give to organic products, but the question could be reversed, how we can incentivize farmers to produce organically and then avoid this cost for society. But let me say that the true cost of food is quite big science at the moment, and we're really trying to understand how this can be reflected on the price, on the final price of production for consumers. But we find very interesting to see how this could be applied on subsidies, for example, and really create a new market for public goods for farmers. So the idea is that we might have a kind of new business model for farmers who are willing to farm in a different way, reduce the cost for society, and so be rewarded by policies for the job they are doing. This could be a very interesting approach that I hope the Commission can follow also in the application, for example, of the eco schemes that now has been delegated to them to come up with some proposal. And I see Tassos is with us today. Maybe we'll mention something about that, hopefully later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo. Bas, the same question to you then that was sent in. What would be the ideal markup maximum price on organic produce?
Let me first of all say that I think it's a good question, but it's very narrow. And what I mean by very narrow is the fact that it only looks at the way it's produced. But let me first of all give you a brief statement that the same organic product from the Netherlands, sold in the Netherlands, has a totally different footprint than if it was an organic kiwi from New Zealand, or if it's in the season or after 9 months in a storehouse with cooling, waiting to be sold in the store. So it's about seasonality. It's about the length of travel. It's about whether it's plant-based or animal-based. So there are a number of different indicators that identify the footprint of a product. But in general, I would say it's important that we provide the opportunity for sustainably produced food to get scale, because I think a significant proportion of the added price, for instance, for organic, but that goes for more what is currently a limited percentage of market share, is the inefficiency as a result of the scale, the inefficiency of the delivery. So if we would be able to actually take out that disadvantage, then I think the extra price that needs to be paid as a result is very limited. And people are really able and willing to pay for a few percent extra price if that is required. But it goes for an incentive on the one side for the sustainably produced food on the one side, but it also goes for paying for greenhouse gases emitted during the production cycle, and that is not a organic or conventional dilemma. It's a different dilemma. So let us in general say we need to have significant pricing of externalities in order to move in the right direction. There is a number of different parameters that define the different price from today's price. And as a result, we simply need to be willing to pay the true price after consensus on what that is, and then see a big difference in supermarket pricing going forward, but not just on the production side, but for instance also on the due date of products on the shelf. I mean, there's a lot of innovation going on when it comes to pricing just before the due date, because we simply throw away too much food that is still possible to eat, simply because we don't have the smart systems to actually do dynamic pricing just before the runoff date. And there's a lot of technology and innovation taking place also in the retail chains to actually make that happen in order to improve that situation.
So, Ben, I want to put another question that is, it's also about true prices, but it's from a slightly different perspective that has come in from Pierre-Olivier Dreg, who is the ELO president. He wants to know how you deal with imported products from third countries where sustainable production is not a central issue because of the impact they will have on prices.
Okay, I mean, in New Zealand, in terms of what we import from other places, in general, we operate a very low tariff or zero tariff structure. So, so there's no tax really as such on products that come in from outside. And then it becomes a question for consumers to decide as to whether or not what sort of price they want to pay for products, perhaps from different origins, bearing in mind that origin is not necessarily always a good indicator of quality or sustainable production or anything of that sort, but consumers being consumers will make their decisions.
Okay, another question has come in and it's for the whole panel, and it's how could you encourage local farmers to interact with government to engage more on food sustainability? Bas, your thoughts on that briefly, because I want to come on to a question for all of the panel to wrap up, which I'm going to ask you for concrete ideas on. So just give me your brief thoughts in response to that question.
I'll be short. I think farmers can do better in influencing policymakers. Farmers very often tend to focus on their farm, which is their passion. But at the same time, I think as a result, it would be good if there would be a more intensive dialogue between the farming community and voters and government in order to link the sustainability agenda to their day-to-day worries on farm in order to live up to those expectations. So I think a more intensive dialogue would be welcome. And I also at the same time would hope that people who represent the consumer would stimulate the government to raise the awareness by the average consumer to actually understand what farmers are doing, how they produce their food, and how a true price and the right price and a good price for food is actually beneficial to us all.
Okay, then as a wrap-up question I'm going to ask for the whole panel is, what examples can you give me about new business models or transformative business models that could really answer some of these questions here today? What have you seen from best practice that you think should be brought forward? Eduardo, let you go first.
Yes, as I said, we need to think very holistically, and we need to create new business model to make the transition happening. I mean, organic per se is a best practice. It's we started without a market, without a regulation that was helping us to start, and then the regulation helped us to have a common play field, and we gained our market step by step. And the key was really working together, making the farmers, working with the processing industry, with the traders, with the retailers. By discussing all together, we could come up with a model that is trying to change the dynamics on the agri-food sector. So I would say the organic model can be one that we can look at it when it's about building up a new business model for a sustainable agri-food system.
Ben, what examples have you seen in terms of really concrete best practice in sorting out who pays for this? Where do we, is innovation the solution in creating more money that can go into paying for a sustainable future for everyone?
Well, I think very much innovation is the key, but I'm not necessarily convinced that it costs more to be sustainable. I think sustainability is as much about being efficient with your resources, and that sometimes means that being sustainable actually saves you money. So I'm not sure that's the question. And then as far as new business models are concerned, yes, of course, people can select to promote their products on the basis of their sustainability and tell their story accordingly. But I don't think that solves the sustainability problem, if that's what we're thinking, that there is a sustainability problem, because that requires everybody to be moving towards something that's more sustainable. So I'm not entirely convinced that the business models themselves are broken. I think it's a lot to do with alignment of incentives. It's about governments setting some clear policies and frameworks and providing the incentives for producers to become more sustainable and to provide that to consumers.
Bas, your thoughts. Do you agree that it's all about incentives, or are there new business models or transformative business models and new approaches or best practices concretely that you could point to that would ensure change?
I spent a lot of time in our biodiversity monitor that we built jointly with Royal Frisian Campina and WWF. And what I saw there is that the first dialogue between the NGO and the production company is very tough. And once you start understanding each other better, you can actually find common ground, and you can find ways to get a model that can work for all parties involved. And the same goes for what Eduardo just said. I think there are a number of elements in the organic way of producing where mainstream players can learn a lot from. I think at the same time that the organic sector can learn some of the lessons that are learned by the conventional sector, for instance, when it comes to efficiency or those types of things. So we should learn more from each other. And if we are able to make that connection also to the consumer, then I'm realistically and hopeful that they are willing to pay slightly more. And if and when we feel that that is not moving fast enough, I think there is no problem to lift the minimum standard while at the same time create a race to the top in order to stimulate innovation. So I'm optimistic that that will work as soon as the consumer becomes more aware of the impact of its daily shopping.
Thank you very much, Bas. I think that's all the time we have for on this panel. So thank you very much once again to Ben, to Bas, and to Eduardo for taking all those questions from our audience. Now, don't forget, we still want you to continue to send in questions for panel 2, which is coming up in just a moment. I want you to share on social media, use that hashtag FFA2020. Send in your questions for the panelists. As you can see, we are trying to get through them online using the form on your screen. And also we have, of course, another Mentimeter poll for you to help set the debate tone for our second session. And the question that we have here for the fourth question is, should farmers diversify from being just food producers to also farmers for biodiversity? This is a slightly trickier question because you don't have the answer saying both. So we will let you vote in real time on that.